Good morning. 3 minutes after 10 is the time. I don't want to sound insensitive, but is there a finer story ever? Has there ever been a finer story for highlighting the hypocrisy of right-wing, quotes, thinking, end quotes, than the Labour plan to remove VAT exemptions from private schools? I do not understand this tiny number of parents who are complaining about it. Why are they not being told by their friends in the Conservative Party and the British media to cancel their Netflix subscriptions or eat fewer avocados or possibly discover the value range of food that some supermarkets have on offer? It's quite extraordinary how unaware people seem to be of how ridiculous they sound when they deny the existence of genuine poverty or the necessity of food banks, but reach for the biggest violins in the world when a tiny number of parents warn that they may not be able to send their children to private schools anymore. Those of us who are lucky enough to be in a position to do so because it is unfair. It is a desperate attempt to ensure that other people's children don't enjoy advantages that your own children don't. And when that pool of people that can afford it shrinks by a tiny amount, the world actually becomes fairer. We may get onto that story a little later in the programme, but I struggle to contain my amusement at the absolutely extraordinary contradiction of attitudes on display from people who don't think it's possible to be poor, or indeed that anybody should be helping the poor in this country. God forbid that taxpayers might do so, but at the same time, the tax take should be manipulated in order to ensure that people spending money on education for their children, that 90% of the country can't afford, should somehow do so under the guise of charitable status. 5 minutes after 10 is the time. In fact, I'll let you decide whether we talk about that later in the programme. You can let me know your thoughts via all the usual channels. Because we must begin in altogether more serious territory, altogether choppier waters. And the level of understanding is extraordinarily low on some coverage of the latest crisis in Gaza this morning, and I presume deliberately. So what I'm going to do, and I stress this, what I'm going to do is try to explain to you what I think is happening, and then invite you to tell me, or to answer the question that I will end with. And that question will be, what are they hoping to achieve? So I don't know how much you know. I'm on a crash course every day. Please don't think I'm casting myself as some sort of font of all knowledge. But I don't know how much you know about the Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, as it is rather unhelpfully initialised as. That's UNRWA. When do you think it was founded? When do you think it was founded, and why do you think it was founded? I think even trying to have a conversation about the decision by several Western governments to suspend their funding of this organisation over allegations that some UNRWA staff were involved in the 7th of October atrocities, attacks on Israel, even beginning to have a conversation about it without explaining two or three enormously important things is a gross dereliction of duty, particularly as children who are already facing death by bombardment are now likely to starve to death. It was founded in 1949. Do you know why it was founded? It was founded to care for the 700,000 Palestinian people who either fled from their homes or were forced from their homes with the creation of the State of Israel. That's not an opinion, okay? That's counting. And those Palestinians ended up in Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and they continue to work. Israel is, the current Israeli regime is deeply opposed to UNRWA, not just its work, but also its existence, because it entrenches the status of Palestinians as refugees. Even its very title entrenches the notion that Palestinian people living in Gaza, which is where we will focus on today, are refugees. And Israel, of course, has to reject that definition in order to pursue some of the policies that it pursues. And you could argue, from a position of support and sympathy, that Israel has to reject that definition in order to safeguard its own survival, its own continuing existence. But that is why, since 1949, or since 1948, really, when the removal of humans began, That is why Israel has a problem with its very existence. In Gaza alone, there are about 13,000 people on the payroll. It's impossible to exaggerate the role that it plays. It is essentially a government proxy, a government surrogate, a substitute government. It runs schools, health centres. It produces teacher training centres as well as medical facilities. It produces textbooks that educate young Palestinians. It is a crucial platform, a key platform of infrastructure for Palestinian people who suffer the twin horrors of being essentially blockaded by Israel and Egypt, while also being governed by the bloodthirsty death cult that is Hamas. And it is perfectly possible that some of the people who work for the organisation are Hamas sympathisers, as Israel has alleged. In fact, let's use the word plausible. It is plausible that there are Hamas sympathisers on a payroll of more than 13,000 people. But that's just my opinion. I think it's plausible. You may think that's unfair. The opinion of the International Court of Justice in The Hague is that it is perfectly plausible that Israel has already embarked upon genocide in that region. That's the second area of ignorance that should be addressed before anyone dares to talk to you about this issue. The idea that the International Court of Justice could have gone any further on Friday than it did. That the final judgment on whether genocide has been committed or not is years away. But make no mistake, in saying that it is plausible and ordering Israel to take steps and take measures to stop certain actions is about as far as anyone could have expected them to go on that specific question. There is legal debate over whether or not they could have ordered a ceasefire or called for a ceasefire in the region. There is no legal debate among honest people about the significance of a ruling that finds Israel it is a plausible case that genocide is underway. So I woke up this morning looking at some elements of the UK media, not all, happily, but looking at some elements of the UK media, goggle-eyed, that you would think it was a bigger story to be talking about some plausible allegations against a handful of workers on a payroll of 13,000 than the plausible genocide, the plausibility of genocide currently underway in Gaza. Those are the facts, right? Those are the facts. That's not an opinion. There's no side picked at this point. That is why UNRWA exists. That is what is happening on the ground. That is what was decided by the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Those are all facts. And then we come to the decision by Western countries, some Western countries, 9 or 10 Western countries, to withdraw funding for the agency, something that Donald Trump did actually. In 2018, I think, and Joe Biden restored. So here is what I think has happened. And this, I stress, is opinion, okay? 12 minutes after 10 is the time, and all we've had so far are facts. Now we're going for some opinion. And it's an opinion born in a very tiny way of my own journey, for want of a better word. And you'll remember that nobody sensible denied Israel's right to respond robustly and, quotes, proportionately, end quotes, after the October the 7th attacks on Israel and the taking of hostages who continue to be held in the region, where over 25,000 people have now died, including some hostages. So you start from that point, and you don't know when you are expressing support for that position, you don't know what proportionate means. You don't know when that support should end. But you're just a punter listening to the radio or a gob on a stick talking into a microphone. It doesn't really matter ultimately that you can't answer that question. It matters that governments can't. It matters that governments haven't. It matters that politicians haven't expressed a clear line on when too much becomes too much. Simplistic, perhaps even crass, to use a body count. 20,000 is acceptable, 30,000 is not. 50,000 is acceptable, 500,000 is not. 10,000 dead children is collateral damage, 20,000 dead children is genocide. These are the decisions that it takes courts years to settle on, but politicians don't have years to pick their positions, and they pick their positions so quickly, they went so far, so fast in support of Benjamin Netanyahu that they can't climb down again. If a British politician, if a Tory politician, if Rishi Sunak or Joe Biden, who is not right-wing under most readings of the definition, but on international relations or foreign policy probably is, if they called for a ceasefire now, or indeed, well, let's start from that. If they called for a ceasefire now, the whole world would shout, what's changed? Why weren't you doing it 2 months ago? Why weren't you doing it when most of your fellow UN countries were doing it? What have you done? Why have you allowed all these further deaths to occur if all it has been is a holding pattern before ceasefire is demanded? And they can't do that. So by an extraordinary coincidence, when the world's attention was focused on the International Court's ruling in The Hague on the plausibility of genocide being underway beneath our very noses, by an extraordinary coincidence, Israel came forward with allegations about members of a workforce that numbers more than 13,000 people. So desperate is the Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, so desperate is it to keep in some cases, the only aid that Israel permits to pass into the Gaza Strip is aid policed by this organisation. So desperate are they to keep those pathetic little taps dripping that they have sacked people already without investigation or conclusion. So desperate are they to keep things moving, to keep these rusty, dirty, pitiful wheels turning, but the only wheels delivering basics like flour or insulin into Gaza. So desperate is this organisation that has existed since 1949 to continue doing its work that they've already fired people. No investigation, no fair trial, no publication of evidence. Israel's made allegations. They seem to me to be plausible. The agency has responded by firing people. Imagine if someone on this radio station was accused of something awful and I stopped getting paid as a consequence of that. That would be more or less the equivalent of what has happened here. And I think the reason for it is it provides a lifebelt for Western governments. I think the Israeli government has thrown a lifebelt to Western governments that they can now cling to, rather than having to focus on the findings of the International Court, the failure already of Israel to obey its instructions, to ensure, for example, that they do everything they can to make sure aid gets into Gaza. There are already protests and civilians trying to block the passage of aid into Gaza at certain gates. They don't seem to come under any particular pressure from the authorities. So they have thrown a lifebelt to Western governments. And of course, the more full-throated those governments have been in support of an action that the International Court of Justice considers plausibly to be genocide, then the more desperate they are for a lifebelt to cling to. And cling they will. And cling they do. Let's not talk about plausible genocide. Let's talk about a dozen possible Hamas sympathisers in a workforce of 13,000. That's my reading. I hope I'm wrong. I know I say that sometimes, and sometimes I say it a little bit glibly. But my God, I hope I'm wrong. But you need to give me a better explanation. You also need to include an explanation of why on the 4th of January this year, long before these allegations were brought, a former Israeli official called Noga Arbel called for the destruction in the Israeli parliament, called for the destruction of UNRWA, actually saying we can't win this war unless we destroy them. Not for reasons of sympathy with Hamas, but for reasons of historic support for both the Palestinian people and the notion of their refugee status. So that is what I think is happening. I think that the Israeli government, with these allegations, has thrown a lifebelt to governments who have been full-throated in their support of what has now been adjudged by the International Court of Justice in The Hague to be plausibly a genocide. And I don't know where to go from there. So what is this withdrawal of funding for this agency designed to achieve? I can tell you what it will achieve. And again, this is an opinion rather than counting. But I stress that it's not my opinion. It is the opinion of the people that run the United Nations. And their opinion is that it will, at the very least, and very, very quickly, cause an actual famine. So they haven't had the opportunity yet to dig corpses out of the rubble in Gaza. But the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food has said that famine was imminent but is now inevitable. The news that the US and 9 other countries, including the UK, were suspending additional funding to the agency, in his words, collectively punishes over 2.2 million Palestinians. So you not only have accusations of Hamas sympathies directed at 9 or 10 individuals who've already been fired without investigation or production of evidence, being used to paint all 15,000 or 13,000 employees in the region as being somehow collectively guilty. You also have 2.2 million Palestinians being punished over unproven but plausible allegations being made by a regime that is plausibly in the middle of a genocide. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. 0345 600973 is the number that you need to tell me either what you think is going on, because by God, O'Brien, you've got it horribly wrong. Front of the queue for you, because I would love nothing more than to have read this incredibly bleak and cynical analysis of mine to be incredibly wrong. And the second question is, what is it designed to achieve? What is it designed to achieve? By sympathisers, Matthew's been in touch to call me a liar. By sympathisers, I should be clear, the accusation is that these people were involved, supportive of the terrorist atrocity on October the 7th. Absolutely important to be completely clear about that. So 10 or 12 individuals from a workforce of 13,000 stand accused of complicity in or contribution to that terrorist atrocity, accused by a government adjudged by the International Court of Justice in The Hague to be plausibly embarked on a genocide. It's very important we get all the facts out there. And the punishment for those alleged terrorists is to cut off some of the only aid for 2.2 million people already facing carnage and starvation. I don't understand why. Well, rather, I think I do understand why in the short-term immediate analysis, but I don't understand what it's designed to achieve. What is Rishi Sunak hoping this will achieve, this withdrawal of some of the only aid going into arguably the most benighted corner of our planet? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. What is this designed to achieve in the minds of the people who are doing it? Because in the minds of the people who are fighting it, i.e. the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, it will achieve inevitable famine. What do the supporters of it think it is designed to achieve? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And remember, more perhaps than on any other day since this dismal business started, I really, really hope I'm wrong. It's 10:22. 24 minutes after 10, Sheena puts it quite well, I think. I find it shocking, James, that members of the Israeli cabinet can make genocidal statements, as called out by the International Court of Justice, and the US and UK will still send arms. But 12 UNRWA members out of 13,000 are allegedly involved in the terror attack of October the 7th, and they stop aid to all 2.2 million Palestinians. How could you respect or want to fight for a government that does that? I don't know. I might take that point. Call them terrorists if you want, rather than alleged terrorists. There are 12 of them so far. And their existence is enough to cancel aid to 2.2 million Palestinians. There are members of the cabinet, the Israeli government, who are off the hook under the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction because they're not involved in the military strategy deployed in Gaza, but they have made full-throated statements in full-throated support of what is, I mean, at the very least, ethnic cleansing. And yet we remain supportive of them. Gabriel's in Battersea. Gabriel, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I think what we're just witnessing, and I think everyone's we know it's just the extermination of the people of Gaza. One of the things that your staff member earlier was asking me is about, how this compares to, the UN. And I don't know if you know. Sorry, I'm mixing my words a little bit.
Take your time. Take a moment. It's okay. I mean, obviously, you can't use the word extermination entirely unchallenged. It is not crystal clear plausible. It's plausible, Gabriel. According to the International Court of Justice, it's a plausible word to use, but it's not an obvious word to use. But that's me just splitting hairs for the sake of important issues, but it's not central to why you've rung in. Well, so the two questions that we're addressing are: what are they hoping to achieve, the governments that have supported this withdrawal of aid, or what have I got wrong?
I think that's quite a hard question in itself. I honestly believe this is just a way to speed up the occupation of Gaza. When you just look at I think there was a recent conference held in Israel, an Occupy Gaza conference, which was attended by pretty much every senior minister, or most of the senior ministers of the right. You've got Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Daniela Wise, all of these people.
That was this weekend, I think. Is that where we saw the footage of settlers dancing at the prospect of? That's
right. Yeah, okay. At the prospect. But on top of that, you've got the likes of these senior ministers making speeches talking about how they need to occupy Gaza now. I think this UN, this accusation of the UN, and I think what we have to remember is, these UN staff members they're still being accused. There is still no evidence that it's been done. I know there's been no denial from the UN, but the Israeli government's been discrediting the UN for quite a long time. Even just recently, what's his name? Gilad Erdan stood up in front of the UN on Holocaust Memorial Day, wearing the Star of David, pretty much lambasting the entire UN for being anti-Semitic.
Okay, I didn't see that, so I'll have to take your word for it.
Yeah, if you look, he basically stood up.
But don't worry, I will. I'll check, but I don't want to distract you from the central point. And maybe, I think what possibly we're both frightened of is the fact there is no answer to this question. Just as there was no answer to the question of how much retaliation from Israel will be too much for people like Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak. What are you hoping to achieve by withdrawing this aid? They don't know. They don't know what they just think it's the right thing to do in the current climate, because the alternative would be to go all in on what the International Court of Justice found on Friday.
Yeah, I think with the International Court of Justice as well. Obviously, I understand. I understand the position they took. I think by the International Court of Justice obviously could not, for legal reasons, issue a ceasefire order. First of all, they don't have jurisdiction, and second of all, technically, I think legally, I'm not a lawyer, but legally, I think if you look at the legalities of it, Israel does have a right to defend itself.
Yes,
so by having a terrorist attack upon them, they had the right to in essence go after the terrorists. Now, how they're executing that is a completely different matter. So the argument is how they're actually perpetrating this particular assault on Gaza is what I like to call it. But yeah, the way I see it is it's literally just trying to speed up the occupation of Gaza, and this is a very good excuse to do it. If you implicate
that involves the tacit support, then, and maybe I'm a bit naive on this, but I think you're suggesting that the governments supportive of this withdrawal of funding are supportive of the acceleration you describe, and you use the word occupation, which it wouldn't get you fired from the Israeli cabinet, so I don't see why it should get you into trouble on this program.
And I think they are. Look, I think the way it has been for anyone that's been following this conflict for a while. Gaza is literally a pimple on the back of Israel that they've tried to subdue for a long time. They just want this to be over. They want this to be done. I know it sounds a bit macabre and a bit sinister, but I think that's what's actually going on. By withdrawing this funding to the UN, you stop aid. Already we know that Gaza is on the verge of a famine. We've already lost over 30,000 people. God knows how many under the rubble. God knows how many people are going to die from infections, diseases, in the next months. And I think before any kind of ruling comes from the ICJ, they just want this to be over and done with. That's why they're having these conferences talking about let's reoccupy Gaza. I'm sure they've already approved rebuilding settlements. And I think the central thing that a lot of people forget, and we always need to remember, is that Israel is an occupying force. It's an occupying power. It's not just Israel versus Gaza, they're two separate states. They've been occupying Gaza, and they're constantly assaulting the West Bank. So this is just a good way just to get rid of Gaza, get rid of the Gaza problem, as they like to call it, occupy it, and then deal with the West Bank following that.
And the attrition of that rhetoric has been extraordinary. People who, in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attack, would have furiously refuted any of the claims that you've just made, have gone very quiet since the turn of the new year, since the beginning of December probably. The idea that there is a horrible subtext here, that Netanyahu is dedicated to what he described as a younger man, as being a desire. And of course the Likud manifesto has contained the words "from the river to the sea." Although, if you put them on a banner marching through London, you'll have Suella Braverman trying to throw you in jail. But if you put them on a election documentation as a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's political party, you end up Prime Minister. Funny old world, isn't it? Thank you, Gabriel. Phone lines are open. What have I got wrong? Please God, I've got something wrong. And secondly, if I haven't, what are these countries supportive of the withdrawal of funding, taking away, in some cases, the only avenues of aid into an area where people are already starving? What is it designed to achieve? Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 10:35 is the time. Not for the first time. I probably need to review my use of the word Britain this morning. The First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, has made it clear that the Scottish Government has not paused or withdrawn aid to UNRWA. I'm never going to get used to saying that. UNRWA is an acronym not designed for ease of speaking, isn't it? So it makes everybody sound like Jonathan Ross. He, in contrast to what the BBC had reported, Yousaf has tweeted in the last 24 hours that the Scottish Government has not paused or withdrawn aid. We have previously provided as much as we can within our financial constraints, about, I think, £750,000. In two separate instalments last year. America, meanwhile, pays by far the biggest amount of money after Joe Biden restored it, but it is still just $340 million. And while we're collecting statistics, I should remind you that more than 150 United Nations employees have been killed so far in the attacks on Gaza. I'll say that again. 150 United Nations employees have been killed so far. 12 have been accused of taking part in the October the 7th attack on southern Israel. Israel, meanwhile, has been found to be plausibly engaged in genocide by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So make sense of this for me. The Palestinians are being punished. Every Palestinian in Gaza is being punished for the existence of allegations against 12 members of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Jeannie's in Loughborough. Jeannie, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I believe that it has achieved the greatest PR coup for Israel to distract the world's attention from the charge of potential plausible genocide by Israel that we heard from the ICJ. The timing is incredibly suspect. On Israel's part, I believe they're saying, we can reduce bombing, we can just starve them out. It is an absolute disgrace for all the 9 governments. It is the lowest that our UK government has ever sunk with regards to morality, integrity, or leadership. And just finally, in closing, we need to understand that, as far as I know, the alleged information gained, which has summarily dismissed these Palestinians without investigation, without charge, was gained potentially by torture, which would be in total opposition to every law of the land or on this earth. It is cynical, it is unethical, it is evil, and I think our government should hang their head in shame.
What do you think their hope is? If in the highly unlikely event of Rishi Sunak talking to proper journalists about this instead of about banning vapes for children today, you say, what's the plan? What is it designed to achieve? What do you think he would say?
Well, I think they have said that they stand with Israel, and I think we will fall with Israel as well, unfortunately. But I also believe that when the ICJ has made it clear that within 3 weeks or less by now, that Israel is to report back on how they have met the regulations, especially to increase aid to the refugees. What will Israel's excuse be? Well, the world community has reduced our aid, the aid coming in, so we're doing the best we can.
Good God, I hadn't thought of that.
We are complicit, totally complicit. It is a disgrace. We have sat by and watched children being murdered, blown to bits, and we say that we're a Christian country and we endorse it. How would Rishi Sunak feel if one of those children happened to be his? He's a father, he has a wife. How would he feel if this was happening to him? It is an absolute disgrace. It makes me ashamed, absolutely ashamed, not just of our lack of humanity, but our lack of moral high ground and conscience.
Well, you speak, of course, of a government that is in some corners, or at least of a governing party that has plenty of people dedicated to the withdrawal from the European Convention on human rights, which I think is one of the safeguards against torture or evidence gleaned through torture. I have read that accusation. I haven't read any proof of it, Jeannie, and I'm pretty confident you have either, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to put it into the mix, just as indeed the plausibility of genocide being committed by Israel has been established by the International Court of Justice. This is probably the most extraordinary element of the whole story for me at the moment, and I want to read you some words from Una Hathaway, who's a professor at Yale Law School and the director of that school's Center for Global Legal Challenges, a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, speaking to the New Yorker at the weekend. She said, I think what this decision is saying is that Israel has engaged in acts that could plausibly constitute violations of the Genocide Convention, both genocidal acts and perhaps incitement to genocide, and that there's enough here that's been alleged that those allegations are plausible. So they haven't found that genocide has necessarily taken place, but the situation is dire enough that it is necessary for the court to issue these provisional measures. So it's a pretty big blockbuster, I think, because the court is finding that Israel, which of course is a state that was created after World War II for the protection of those who had been subject to the horrors of the Holocaust, is the subject of plausible claims that it is in violation of the Genocide Convention, which was a convention that in large part was created for the purposes of condemning and attempting to prevent genocides like the Holocaust from ever happening again. So this is a momentous decision. 12 allegations against 12 members of a 13,000-strong workforce. We can, for the ease of argument, we can describe them as plausible. They are plausible allegations. Indeed, some people have already been fired without trial, without investigation, and without evidence. They have been fired. And yet, it's the 2.2 million Palestinians who are facing further punishment today, and not the people whose regime has been found to be plausibly engaged in violations of the Genocide Convention. I don't know that anybody can make sense of this in a way that is less bleak than the analyses we've heard so far. But I stress again, you are welcome to try. 10:42 is the time. Hassan is in Kensington. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Look, I think the past few callers have been extremely articulate, and the short term, Israelis want to distract us from the ICJ judgment, and I think the long term plans are to destroy UNRWA and this entire sort of continued refugee status for the Palestinians. And I'm really glad you mentioned that Israeli female administrator who did the speech.
Noga Arbel, a former Israeli official. I don't precisely know her history, but she said our main goal in the war is to eliminate the threat and not to neutralize it. And we know how to eliminate terrorists. It is more difficult for us with an idea. UNRWA is the source of the idea. So she's calling for the destruction of UNRWA and says it must begin immediately. And here we are, less than a month later, arguably seeing some of the early stages of the destruction of that agency.
Yeah. I think absolutely, James, and I'm glad you're having this discussion, but I think our focus must remain on the ICJ judgment, where literally 16-1, 15-2 of the judges, and these were US, German, French, Australian judges, right, who came out against, even the Israeli judge joined in that genocidal statements need to be punished.
Yes.
And then what does Smotrich and Ben-Gvir do? They show up at this reoccupation conference where they talk about voluntary migration, which then Israeli communication minister accepts that this is actually coerced migration, i.e. ethnic cleansing, where you destroy people's homes and then say, can you voluntarily migrate somewhere else now? And I think that is what our focus should be. And I think we should make...
This is, for people who don't know, this was a conference dedicated to what is described as the resettlement of Gaza, a drive for reoccupation and resettlement in the Gaza Strip. And some reports had up to a dozen ministers and 15 members of the Knesset in attendance at this conference.
Yeah, 12 out of 37 ministers, right? 1/3 of the cabinet was there. And I think our focus, or our government's focus should be, we should try and make sure that we are not participating in this genocide by plausible genocide by supplying arms and equipment to the Israeli government. And I think what is also interesting is, look, Trump cut off UNRWA aid, but he lacked legitimacy so much that other countries did not follow him. In this case, Biden has blocked, and 7 other countries have joined in. So it's again shocking that somebody so ridiculous as Trump was actually Biden is turning out to be even worse than Trump on the Gaza and Israel situation.
Because he moves when he moves, people follow. I think we need to remind ourselves that Trump took the decision in absentia of any allegations of terrorism against members of UNRWA staff, and Biden has not. It might be a bit of a fig leaf, but I think it's important to put it out there. And I suspect you would agree with this, that the defunding makes it almost impossible for the ICJ orders to be implemented.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is literally a lifeline for 2.2 million Gazans who are facing starvation, who are facing incredible injuries, who have had their entire sort of infrastructure of health and supply disrupted. And is this the time to actually cut off funding for this organization?
It's extraordinary. The more we talk about it, the more extraordinary it appears to be. And in the absence of any substantive answer to the question of what they're hoping to achieve, it becomes ever bleaker. Hassan, I'm a little late for the break. This conversation is desperately important, not least because elements of the UK media will be keen that you don't understand what is going on and keen to engage in provocations and trivialities while completely ignoring the reality of famine now facing Gaza as a consequence, in part, of British government policy. I'll say that again. A British government policy rendering, in the words of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, rendering famine inevitable in Gaza, where 25,000 people have already been killed by a regime that the International Court of Justice has found to have been plausibly in contravention of the Genocide Convention. I mean, you must know, and I know it's my job to get my head around some of this stuff, and sometimes I fail. But it's 10:47 now, and I don't know that anybody can offer up a single scintilla of opposition or contradiction to what we are describing. The phone lines are open, 0345 60 973. And historically, there is never any shortage of people with whom I often have enormous sympathy. There is never any shortage of people keen to defend any act by Israel or any international act in support of Israel. I have to tell you, it's not happening today. And I'd be keen to redress that. I'd love to know what defence sounds like, looks like. I'd love to. The number is 0345 60 973. 10:48 is the time. 10:51 is the time. It is, I think, worth having a proper look at these words in the Knesset on January the 4th, because it possibly makes sense of what is happening now, whether it's the intention of Western governments or not. This former Israeli official, Noga Arbel, talks about how the regime knows how to eliminate terrorists, but it is more difficult for us with an idea. UNRWA is the source of the idea. The idea is that more and more terrorists are born in all kinds of methods, and it will be impossible to win the war if we do not destroy UNRWA. And this destruction must begin immediately. It is not relevant to talk about the day after. The day is now. We must act to deal with these threats completely, or that we will miss the opportunity window, as we have already done here several times. And the idea that she describes is the idea that Palestinian people in Gaza, but also in many other places as well, are refugees. And as long as that situation is sustained, the rhetoric, the ideology on display here seems to be that the quotes war, end quotes, will never be over. And today's phone-in has been extraordinary in the sense of consensus. And I would like to see that consensus challenged. I really would. But if it isn't, it's hard not to draw conclusions, isn't it? Chris is in Paddington. Chris, what would you like to say?
Well, as the former UNRWA spokesman from 2007 to the beginning of 2020, I would like to make several very brief points.
No, well, just to clarify, spokesman in Gaza for UNRWA.
Well, I was a spokesman for the whole of UNRWA. UNRWA works in Syria, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Gaza. So I spoke for Gaza, indeed, and I went there many, many times. And the places which are now under these £2,000 bombs, I've been in many of these places, and I've heard it was my job to deal with the sorts of accusations that you've been discussing, James, on your programme about the UNRWA workers, etc.
Take your time then, Chris, please.
Well, the first point I'd like to make is that UNRWA is implementing a zero-tolerance policy and always has done. I saw it from the inside against these infringements of neutrality. So before the UN investigation being handled by the Office of Internal Oversight in New York has even finished its investigation, UNRWA has sacked these workers. 9 of them are alive. They have been sacked. 1 is dead and 2 are missing, we believe. That is the equivalent, James, of an enemy of you coming to LBC and saying, I've got some information about James O'Brien. He's been colluding with terrorists, and we want you to sack him, and LBC sacks you. So UNRWA has opened...
And stop paying everybody else on the payroll as well. They'd stop paying Nick Ferrari, they'd stop paying Ian Dale, everyone else would stop getting paid after I was sacked.
And all your listeners as well, the people, the beneficiaries, as it were, who are benefiting from programmes like yours, yes. And let's make no mistake, and it's a good point, not only is UNRWA has taken this very robust action, opening itself up to compensation claims. Let us be clear, the British government and others seem to be supporting this, because one has to ask the question of the British government, what do you want to achieve, given that the staff members have been sacked, even before there's an internal investigation? If that comes back and says, yes, they were doing this, are you going to, well, where does that leave your aid? Yes. There's no answer to the question. It's poor donorship on behalf of Britain. It's not made it clear to UNRWA what it's got to do to get this aid reinstated. And to be clear, aid from Britain to UNRWA in 2018 was 70 million, and last year it was nearer 20. Right. It's already been massively reduced. Yes. So there's that issue. It is punitive and disproportionate. And I say it's punitive, James, because I've been to those food distribution centres. It's the women coming in with their suckling babies, the newborn. It's the sick. It's the elderly. It's the dying. It's the wounded. It's the children with 90% burns who are gasping their last gasp. Those are the people who are going to be punished by this British decision. It's immoral, it's a disgrace, and it should be reversed.
Can you...
Sorry,
no, that's very powerful. And pretty unequivocal, which possibly makes a mockery of my next question. Can you rationalise it? Because none of us have managed to so far. What are they hoping to achieve? I suppose the most obvious answer is they are in lockstep with whatever America does.
Yeah, but I mean, how do you rationalise the irrational?
I don't know.
I mean, what is happening is that I think Britain is marching to America's tune.
Yes.
I think there is huge pressure from the Israelis. This is all on the front page of the New York Times this morning. And guess what? They leaked it the day after an ICJ decision which found that Israel, there was plausible evidence that Israel was basically a genocide suspect on parole. That's effective, as you say, the country, the grouping for whom the word genocide was created, who just lived through the appalling events of the Second World War, now those people, that country, they now stand accused of perpetrating those very things. Now, that's a very serious...
Plausibly accused. Just to clarify, that wasn't my analysis. That was Una Hathaway, a professor at Yale Law School.
That's what the court absolutely said. So yes, it's very hard to rationalise this. But the other point I'd like to make is we've all had our hearts broken by the kibbutznikim, the people on the kibbutzim near Gaza. And what's happened is it appears that if Israel had this information 3.5 months ago, those people in those kibbutzim have been denied accountability, while Israel allegedly, I don't know if this is what they've done, but I imagine they've had this information. It's been around on social media for a very long time. They've withheld that from the UN to do a proper investigation, to get justice and accountability for those poor souls in those kibbutzim, in order to do some news management, cynical news management, the day after this decision by the ICJ. They come out with it in order to knock the headlines about genocide off the front pages. If that's what's happened, if Israel has had this information for 3.5 months, it's cynical news manipulation to protect the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as we heard in the court 2 weeks ago, was inciting genocide. He talked about the Amalek genocide. He invoked it, which is in the I think it's the first or the second book of Samuel, in which God tells Saul to go and kill the Amaleks, all children, all babies, all cattle even. It's pure genocide. And we had pictures in the ICJ court of not just Benjamin Netanyahu saying this, we had then cut to video of IDF soldiers on the ground celebrating the Amalek genocide. There was a clear link between the leadership of the army and the army on the ground doing this. It's appalling. It's shocking. As you say, how do you rationalise something so extraordinary? And I'm afraid to say that when you look at what the British government is doing in punishing the agency, I mean, the other important point,
carry on. I said take your time.
13,000 UNRWA staff today. These were 12 bad apples. The 13,000 staff, I'm speaking to them in Gaza all the time. They are appalled by this. 152 of them have been killed, and in spite of that, this is their finest hour, frankly. They are determined to carry on delivering humanitarian services to some of the most desperate people in the Middle East, and they are as revolted by these accusations, if they're true, as the rest of us are. That is the agency with Rishi Sunak and the government has decided to punish. It is immoral and it is unconscionable.
I mean, in conclusion, Chris, you've used the word cynical a lot to describe news manipulation. Cynical, but successful.
I'm afraid to say it is. I mean, how much time have you dedicated to it on your programme on LBC today? Yes, it's inevitable. It's a story of the day, and journalists have to cover it. And by the way, let me absolutely say, I have no proof that Israel has held on to this information for 3.5 months. I'm saying if that is true, and it'd be very interesting to ask Mark Regev and the other people who come on your programme, how long has Israel had this information? And why did it come out with it the day after that it was, it came up after the indictments that we heard in the ICJ? Why is that? Because if it is, they have been holding on to it. It's denied justice. It's delayed justice and accountability for those poor people in that kibbutz. And it's also, frankly, news manipulation, which is appalling.
Well, there is a difference, I suppose, between reflecting the reality of the story and wading in wholeheartedly on the side of the decision to withdraw the funding, which is morally and philosophically and ethically, I would argue now, particularly having heard from you, completely unsustainable. But we're not talking about journalists who share their thinking, really, just their conclusions. Chris, I've now realised Chris Gannett, former UNRWA spokesman from 2007 to 2020. Thank you for that. It didn't exactly constitute a challenge to the consensus, though, did it? Confusion about what the UK and 8-9 other countries are hoping to achieve by withdrawing this on a logistical level. What is the end game? What is the aim of this? But on a moral or ethical level, how can punishing 13,000 UN workers, of whom 150 have already been killed, or indeed punishing all 0.2 million Palestinians, how can that possibly be a reasonable, fair, moral response to the allegation, the plausible allegation, we could say, that 12 members of UNRWA staff were involved in the October the 7th terror attacks? I don't think anybody can really make sense of that. But you're welcome to try. It's 11:01. 4 minutes after 11 is the time, and it's a sort of a sense, isn't it? A growing sense of escalation in the Middle East. I heard Jeremy Bowen, the veteran BBC foreign correspondent, describing without really pausing today the impossibility of extricating individual acts. These wars, or these conflicts bubbling away constantly, and then flashpoints occur. But the idea that you can separate them from the conflict in Gaza, from the continuing bombardment of Gaza, is absurd. And it was quite refreshing to hear a brilliant journalist just describe reality. We did work out last week why politicians, and this includes both Sunak and Starmer, were so keen to claim that the attacks on Houthi positions had nothing to do with what was going on in Gaza. And it is just about sustainable intellectually. We are bombing these positions because they are shooting at our ships. Full stop, end of conversation. If you continue the conversation, the question of why they are shooting at your ships becomes impossible to ignore. But if you don't continue the conversation, you can ignore that question. And therefore you can claim that attacks on Houthi positions have nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza and Israel. But you can't have a more substantive, you can't have a more sophisticated conversation about anything, including the 3 American troops who've now been killed in a drone attack, without acknowledging that the trouble spots, for want of a heavier phrase, are inextricably intertwined. 34 US personnel hurt, and we will probably find out today what President Biden is going to do in response. So wherever you turn at the moment, all roads lead to the Middle East. The Iranian-backed militias being blamed for the attack on American troops, Tehran denying involvement, negotiations apparently at quite a sensitive stage over the hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza, and yet the oddest, and a Labour MP, of course, suspended over an email to her constituency members describing recent genocides and including Gaza on that list. I mean, Kate Ossamore coming in for predictable criticism over this and probably predictable punishment from her party. But all she had to do to insulate herself from any controversy would be to insert the word plausible before the word Gaza. Because that is the finding of the International Court of Justice. Incredibly silly of her, in my opinion, not to do so. If you really need to include Gaza in a list of genocides, then you have to abide by the finding of the International Court of Justice and describe it merely as a plausible genocide. And she didn't do that. And accordingly, she has had her whip suspended. And I mentioned the negotiations that are ongoing as well in Qatar, likely to achieve success. And yet, of course, I think we've seen another shift. This is a CIA boss in ceasefire talks with Israeli and Qatari spy chiefs, possible ceasefire and hostage exchange. William Burns, Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, and the Prime Minister of Qatar. He is the Prime Minister of Qatar, and a Mossad chief as well, meeting in Paris ahead of a possible deal. But, what would that do to governments that have failed so far to support calls for a ceasefire? Nothing substantive on the ground has changed, except the death toll of Palestinians continues to climb. And now you come to the difficulty that Israel will have in abiding by the International Court of Justice's order that they report back on what they've done to reduce the plausibility of a genocide finding. That, I would argue, has become almost impossible as a consequence of the defunding of UNRWA. But on we go. So I continue this conversation. I'm not sure how long for. I want to free up a couple of phone lines because I want to say something that you might not like. And if there were a hierarchy of sympathy, then obviously the people facing the most urgent likelihood of death and starvation would be at the top of it for all objective people or moral people. You show me 2 suffering humans, I will muster more, 2 suffering innocent humans, and I will muster more sympathy for the one suffering more. You show me, 2 populations who are suffering, innocent populations, and I will muster more sympathy for the one that's suffering more. What's difficult in matters Middle Eastern, of course, is that there's a zero-sum game in play where people are keen to argue that if you feel sympathy for one side, then you can't possibly feel any sympathy for the other. But I feel very sorry for Israelis today, and I want to explain why. I feel very sorry that you've been put in a position of being required to either stay silent or defend the indefensible. And I don't think it's your fault. I really don't. I've spoken many, many times about generational trauma and about the phantom of persecution, the omnipresent phantom of persecution that Jewish people have lived with for millennia, really, and the incredible status that Israel has therefore assumed in the collective memory, the collective consciousness of Jewish people, regardless of where they live in the world. Israel is the haven. It's the place you go when the pogroms start or when the next Holocaust comes around. And as a consequence of that, the relationship between citizen and government has been, to my mind, unique in recent history. The idea that gives citizens perfectly plausible, that's a word we're using a lot today, perfectly plausible reasons for supporting anything the government does in pursuit of defending that haven. But I have a sense this morning, I have done for a while actually, but I have a sense this morning that you can't really justify this. And that's why I feel very sorry for you, because you have been boxed into this position by events, really, and by, I think, some profoundly questionable politicians. Netanyahu's plight, both criminal and ethical, is fairly well documented, but probably not that well understood outside Israel. But you've been boxed into a position now where you are desperately searching around for reasons to support the withdrawal of aid for 2.2 million Palestinians after a dozen people were alleged to be involved in the terrorist atrocity of October the 7th. And I genuinely don't see how you can. I mean, that question has hardened for me, speaking to Chris Gunnis a moment ago, who was the UNRWA spokesman for 13 years. I like this from, it's unsigned. Without wanting to make light of anything, James, how the hell did that guy not get a Ray Liotta? There's a few texts. If you think I'm going to drop a Ray Liotta into a conversation like this one, then you're even dafter than I look. Leon, in response to similar exchanges, says, how is it that the people who call into your show are more informed than most journalists? Well, the answer is that they probably pay a little bit more attention because they have skin in the game in many cases, is the short answer. Although, to contrast that, Mosim Wood Green says, James, you are quite different from all the other LBC presenters. Have you considered working for Al Jazeera? Well, Moss, you're the kind of person I want to ring in, really, because we've done an hour and 12 minutes now of conversation with fairly straightforward questions. What is the aim of withdrawing aid from 2.2 million Palestinians? Is it fair to do so as a punishment for the alleged actions of 12 members of a 13,000-strong workforce? And why is it essentially drawing attention away from the International Court of Justice's finding that Israel is plausibly engaged in genocide? There's no opinion there, mate. Those are all questions based on facts. And if you can't answer them, then that's a you problem, not a me problem, mate. But you know that already. And that's why I feel sorry for people who have historically or traditionally found themselves very powerfully and passionately defending almost anything that Israel has done. I have defended things that Israel has done that to the great annoyance of other people that listen to the programme. But I'm not defending this. And nor are you. The difference, I suppose, is complicity. So you've defended everything up until this point, and now you can't. It's kind of your fault we got here, isn't it? And that's why I feel sorry for you, because that must be a great moral weight, a great psychic toll. And I speak of people possessed of consciences, of course, possessed of consciences. And there are plenty of people on both sides of this debate who don't have consciences. I think that is clear, or at least they don't have an understanding of the extension of conscience to all people, which brings us back to where I began this little contemplation, which is the notion of a hierarchy of sympathy. I feel sorrier for someone with a broken leg than I do for someone with a broken finger. But I still feel sorry for the person with the broken finger. So I'm not suggesting that my sympathy for Israelis today is on anything like my sympathy for Palestinian people in Gaza at this point in history, but it doesn't mean I can't have sympathy. And I won't let anybody tell me that I shouldn't. Okay? The number you need to join in this conversation, 0345 6060 973, is the number you need. What is it designed to achieve? And how can anyone possibly think that it's fair? It's 11:15. 18 minutes after 11 is the time, and the questions remain the same, really. How can anybody think this is fair? How is it not collective punishment? But even if you're comfortable with collective punishment, what's it designed to achieve? What's it designed to achieve? Here's a really good illustration of what I meant when I talked about having sympathy for Jewish people in general, but it's supporters of the Israeli government, perhaps in historical, traditional supporters of the Israeli government in particular. So Marcus texted to say, one side wants the other not to exist or be alive, and it's not Israel. If you're talking about Hamas, I used to agree with that, actually, but I can't anymore. Why should I take the words of some of the members of the Likud cabinet less seriously than the words of Hamas? That's the problem, Mark, is I used to read texts like that and think, oh, crikey, do I need to slightly recalibrate my approach to this subject? Because clearly Hamas are dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. But I don't think you can argue now that there aren't members of the Israeli cabinet who aren't dedicated to the destruction of a Palestinian homeland or the land of Gaza or whatever you prefer to call it. So that doesn't work anymore, mate. And that's what I mean when I talk about sympathy. That used to be a trump card in conversations like this, but it isn't anymore because of people that Benjamin Netanyahu has brought into government and therefore into the international public eye, saying even this weekend utterly unconscionable things, which I'm afraid give the lie to the idea that there's nobody on that side that doesn't want the other side to exist or even be alive, up to and including the International Court of Justice finding the allegation of genocide to be plausible. So that just doesn't work anymore. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. Mahid is in Harrow. Mahid, what would you like to say?
Hi there. I mean, I echo what you were saying about the Israelis and the Jews in particular being boxed into a Zionist white settler colonial project since, God knows when. And I think we have to understand the historical context when we're trying to rationalise what's happening and the decision that was made by not just our government, but by others as well, which, of course, they're following America's,
Yes.
America is a new empire. That's it. It's not the British Empire. It's the American Empire. And England, Australia, Canada, they all follow suit. And when you look at the context, the historical context, even in our recent time about Black Lives Matter, Islamophobia, all of these things have largely gone unchecked. There's been a lot of lip service, but nothing really has happened. And when you look at the plight of the Palestinians, there is a white, Arab, cross there. Palestinian lives have been dehumanized. And when you look at the fact that it is, we can all say that it is plausible, according to the International Court of Justice, that, genocide has been happening. And there's been very, very strong genocidal rhetoric coming out of the Israeli government.
Members of the Israeli
members
government.
of them.
Yes.
But
that's a finding of the court. That's a finding of the International Court. That's just counting. That's not an opinion.
But when you look, then you look at the fact that allegations versus plausibility that has been confirmed in the International Court, allegations that are being, checked by the UN. And when you look at the fact that over 2 million people are being affected by that decision over, 12 bad apples, which, yes, if they've done something wrong, justice should be served.
Well, they've already been sacked, of course, the ones that are still alive. So we've covered a lot of this ground. We've covered a lot of this ground already, and I'm conscious of moving into the second hour of the conversation. Can you explain the end game? Have you any idea of what a positive outcome of this?
It's a very cynical look, because when you look at the metrics of what makes decisions in this country, whether it's the media, whether it's government, certain institutions, there has been very clear evidence that there has been institutional racism. There's very clear evidence that politics and policy...
Forgive me. The question is, it's not the one you're answering. What do you think...
No, but I am getting to that point. I'm going
to have to insist you hurry up a bit. Let me remind you the question I'd like you to answer, because everything you've said so far I've heard 3 or 4 times already this morning out of other callers' mouths and indeed my own. So if Rishi Sunak was sitting in front of you now and you said to him, what's the play here? What's the outcome? What's the win? What would he say?
It's about reinforcing his allies and reinforcing corporate allies as well.
Well, he wouldn't say that, would he?
But that's the only thing that matters to him.
But he wouldn't say that, would he?
But everything that's come out of his mouth has been... He doesn't want to make any comments on when there's a allegation.
Why are you doing this? What is the positive? What is the positive ramification of this policy? What could he say? What would he say?
There's no justification for it, but his justification is he's maintaining his corporate alliances and his political alliances, and at the moment that's all driven by America. It's as simple as that. And he's completely ignoring what even if you look at, say, what you benefit from the Arab alliances, because the Arab countries don't care enough. For them, money is more important. The treaties are more important. They want to get on with their life. And
but again, that's why I'm interested in the theoretical question of what they would say. I mean, he'll have to say something at some point that doesn't fit the narrative that you describe. And I don't know what that answer would look like or sound like at the moment. 24 minutes after 11 is the time, particularly in the context of the thing that they all seem desperate for us not to talk about, which is the extraordinary historical finding of the International Court of Justice in The Hague on Friday. It's 24 minutes after 11. Ita is in Edinburgh. Ita, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello. First of all, I'd like to thank you for feeling sorry for me that I have to defend the actions of the state of Israel.
It's the people who recognise that the actions have become indefensible I feel sorry for.
Right, okay.
So that, I don't think that is you, is it?
Well, we'll see. First of all, I'd like to say something about UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for specifically for Palestinian refugees. The thing is that you talk about the 12 people that Israel said participated in the massacre of the 7th of October.
Yes.
But this might be just the tip of the iceberg, because
or they might not have participated.
No, there are testimonies from hostages that were released who said that they were moved from one place to another,
which would be offered up as which would be offered up as evidence in an investigation or a trial. It certainly wouldn't be. It would never be taken as a verdict, would it?
The thing is that you talk about what was told to you about these 12 people who actually participated in the massacre.
No, nothing's been told to me. Nothing's been told to me. I may need to remind you of the questions that we're actually asking, but before I do that,
right.
I'll just quote the White House National Security Advisor on this, who has pointed out that the alleged violations of a handful of staff, quotes, should not impugn the entire agency, which he added had, quotes, helped save literally thousands of lives in Gaza. They do important work. You, of course, have the right to impugn the entire agency. That's fine. But the question is, what do you think the plan is? What do you think the aim of the withdrawal of funding is, Ita?
I think that this is a good time for the world to correct mistake that was done many years ago, and instead of the UN having two refugee agencies, one specifically for Palestinians and one for the rest of the world, just absolve this UNRWA and make the UNHCR, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the one agency that actually takes care of all the refugees in the world. And while they're at it, change the status of refugees from the special status that Palestinian refugees have, where they can give their refugee status to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and in perpetuity. And just, if you're a refugee, like my grandfather was, both grandfathers, one from Iran and one from Germany, and, they were refugees. They made it to Palestine, later became Israel, and that's where it ended. My parents weren't refugees. I'm not a refugee.
Because they have a homeland?
No. I mean, I have family in Canada and in Australia. And,
but they also have a homeland.
Other places. Yes, they all have a homeland.
Whereas Palestinian people don't. Isn't that the distinction, as I understand it?
Sorry,
and as you said yourself,
you said the UK and the US.
You said yourself that your forebears went back, and when Palestinian people can go back, then I think the case for removing their status would be stronger. Anyway, the point.
My grandfather could not go back to Iran, and my other grandfather had nothing to go back to in Germany. So they were refugees, and they were.
But they have a homeland. I mean, this is why Israel exists, to create a homeland for people who were Jewish people who were dispossessed.
So why is Jordan not the homeland of Palestinians?
Well, I've seen one Israeli politician speaking beside a map of Greater Israel that dispensed with the existence of Jordan altogether. So part of the answer to your question probably lies in that observation, and he's a member of the Israeli government. But listen, I think you may have got the wrong end of the stick. I think you're right. I think that the aim of Israel is to destroy UNRWA and to remove the refugee
UNRWA,
status of the Palestinian people. I think you're absolutely right.
You need to remember that UNRWA is not just these people who hand out food. They're also teachers in all the schools in the
Yes,
Gaza
down
Strip.
with that sort of thing.
And you need to ask yourself...
And medical. Don't forget the medical facilities. We don't want them either.
What are they teaching
Yes.
in these schools?
Well, I don't need to ask myself
Is it
that.
possible that they're teaching that all the Jews are evil and they need to be destroyed?
Is it possible that 200 Israelis are currently standing at one of the few areas where aid can get into Gaza trying to stop the trucks from going through?
They are families of hostages that say if we don't hear from... We don't get a
But that puts them in direct contravention of the International Court of Justice's instructions on Friday.
All right.
But again, I think you're right.
Making it into Gaza or not?
I think you're right. I think that it is designed to remove special status from these people, however many of them are left when the bombardment is over. I think you're absolutely right. I don't know why you thought I would disagree with you.
All right.
That's the plan, isn't it?
I hope so.
Rob them of their special refugee status and destroy the only agency.
Why are they?
Destroy the only agency dedicated to helping them.
Were regular refugees.
Well, you'd have to ask what freedom other agencies would have to get in and out of Gaza at the moment, wouldn't you?
Well, right now, a truck that goes into Gaza is immediately taken over by Hamas.
Right now, it can't get in, can it, at Qam Abu Shalom, because the Israeli people are blocking the trucks carrying humanitarian aid into the area. But I say again, I agree with you. I think that is absolutely the plan. Get rid of the agency that's helping them and deprive them or denude them of their refugee status, despite the fact that, unlike you, these people do not have a sovereign homeland anywhere in the world. 100% agree. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 11:34 is the time. Well, I thought we were going to be talking about vapes this morning, and we probably will in the final hour of the programme. But it's a very sad conversation. The idea that the withdrawal of aid from, or one of the only sources of aid, the withdrawal of funding for one of the only sources of aid in Gaza has achieved the support of our own government for reasons that are not clear. The rationale given for it is allegations of involvement in the October the 7th terror attack upon Israel by Hamas that have been levelled at so far about a dozen members of the United Nations agency workforce, a workforce that runs into the 13,000 plus. And I cannot make sense of it, except under Ita's contribution, which is that it is... I know what Israel's plan is. I'm surprised that the British... And I don't actually think the British government are going along with it. I'm not sure Rishi Sunak, if he was sitting here now, could offer up a really detailed explanation of why they are complicit in causing famine under one expert analysis of the situation. I really don't think he could. But I think for a certain brand of Israeli ideology, the idea of removing the special status, if you like, of Palestinian refugees is key to the broader project, and getting rid of the United Nations agency dedicated to Palestinian refugees would be crucial to that. There's a rather good tweet here that puts it very well from Shakaf, who says any other refugee in the world, like many in the UK, for example, receive permanent status in the countries they are in. Only Palestinians are still considered refugees 3 generations after their grandparents were relocated from what now is Israel. I mean, relocated is a bit of a euphemism in many of those cases, but we'll let that pass. UNRWA is providing education to those dependents of refugees, teaching them that they have the right to return to Jaffa, to Haifa, or to Galilee. No other refugee group in the world can claim their right of return 75 years after they've been expelled from their homes. For 75 years, the Palestinians rely on international support instead of solving the refugees' problem. If the refugees' problem was to be solved tomorrow, UNRWA would be dissolved. And as any organisation, they first and foremost deal with self-preservation. So this is the point, I think, that Ita was making. Another note, mentioning the idiot Israeli politicians, especially the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, as representing the entirety of Israel, is similar to saying Enoch Powell represents the UK policy. Well, then surely, under that reading, representing the 12, quotes, idiots, end quotes, accused of being involved in the October the 7th terror attacks as representing the entirety of UNRWA would be even worse behaviour, with even worse consequences. And these are members of government. These are not like random eccentric MPs or politicians on the fringes of a governing party. These are people in the cabinet. So I don't think some of that analysis works, but I do understand better the sober dedication to the belief that UNRWA is not a force for good because it perpetuates the refugee status of Palestinian people, to which I think my homeland point speaks pretty directly. Cease to be a refugee when you have a homeland. If you don't have a homeland, you are in a state of perpetual refugee-ness, for one, which is something that I would have applied to Jewish people prior to 1948, actually, the same definition. Tanya's in Harrow. Tanya, what would you like to say?
Well, I think what Rishi Sunak will actually say will be that we're not cutting aid at the moment, we're just suspending it until we can do further investigation. And
until we can what? So I didn't hear you. The line's not great. Until we're suspending it until
we can until further investigation.
Okay.
Yes.
But they've already fired the accused, though. So what would further investigation achieve? It's a strange one, isn't it?
I know, but that is literally what, if you looked at the American politicians, that's what they've been saying. So they're just going to say the same thing. But actually, there's something you said that I really resonated with, which is I'm pro-Palestinian, but I do feel a lot of sympathy for Israelis after this current thing, because I listened to the news, 24 Israeli soldiers died, right?
Yes.
And I thought, no one is going to feel sympathy for these young men, outside Israel. No one's going to care. These people have died, because they're to them, they're just perpetrators of this possible genocide. And I thought that must be incredibly sad and isolating for everyone in Israel to know that no one is going to care that whether you're, because they're very young. They're 19-year-old is maimed for life, has died. No one is going to care. And that must be so sad, right? And then obviously, the Palestinian people, when you look at the majority of them are children that are dying, and women and children. You feel more sympathy, yes. But
but not to the exclusion of sympathy for other people, even people involved in the killing of those children, in the killing of those civilians.
This is just going to make it worse, because
that's the bit that we come back to, and actually we haven't come to it yet today. Is the abiding question of how any of this will possibly make things better in the future. The reason
I feel like they're doing it, is if you see the actual at The Hague, South Africa used majority of the evidence from the UN. So it's on in the court saying that these are your bodies that are saying this.
Yes.
And then in the decision, the American judge, she specifically mentioned all the UN agencies, right? Yes. And so right now, the only UN agency that can get aid into Gaza is UNRWA, right? So now if you put doubt into that whole transport system, you have to stop it. You can't get, there's no way that aid is coming in. I can donate, but how's it going to get in other than this agency? So I think this is the reason why they're attacking it, because it's attacking the fundamental of this agency is part of UN. So if this is corrupt, then that means that all the other ones are corrupt. And then it's just going to make it more worse and more isolating. And then no one is, it's like, I know I don't want to compare it, but no one, there's a saying, I remember saying, no one says there's a sympathetic Nazi. They're all the same, right? And it must be really devastating to know that
I'm uncomfortable with that word appearing in the context of this conversation, but you're speaking to the sort of not in my name school of thought, I think.
No, I don't want to make it like that, but I just want to say
no, I understand. I just don't like that word in the context of this conversation. I think it's really unhelpful. But I do. But I know you're not drawing a direct parallel. You're just talking about situations in history when a whole population is considered complicit in the actions of a government, when clearly lots of people in that population would not be supportive of that government. What I found interesting today is how hard it is to find people who are supportive, and everyone who is will be like Ita in Manchester, essentially calling for the dissolution of the agency that came into existence in 1949 to deal with the very specific plight of Palestinian people, about 700,000 then, Palestinian people removed from their homes to make way for the modern state of Israel. And the idea that they retain refugee status and pass it on to children and grandchildren is a thorn in the side of the state. It really is. I don't know whether I can make a powerful case for removing it, though, without completely ignoring the history. And the minute you start completely ignoring the history in any conversation about that part of the world, all bets are off. 11:42 is the time. Dina is in Cheltenham. Dina, what would you like to say? Oh, I think
Hello.
Hello, Dina. What would you like to say?
Regarding what do I think the plan is, I think that the Israeli government's plan was set in place from October the 7th. The atrocities that happened on October 7th gave them the green light for their master plan of the reduction of Palestinians and ideally the complete eradication of them. And I don't use those words lightly, James. I think this has been happening for decades, for 75 years. It's not the fault of mass media in this country, which is predominantly Zionist-owned, because it doesn't suit their narrative. But Palestinians are commonly arrested, commonly killed in the West Bank, not just Gaza. And it.
No, the phone line keeps ducking in and out. Try and if you can. I know it's not really fair, but if you can just make your conclusions in a couple of sentences, because I can't trust this phone line, Dina.
I think the ultimate goal for Netanyahu is to continue this genocide program.
Plausible genocide program. You can't call it genocide. No, I'm not splitting hairs. You can't use that word in the. Well, you have the caveat of saying that is my opinion. It's not a word.
Okay, eradication then of Palestinians, and I think he is waiting for Biden to either pop his clogs or to be ousted and wait for his buddy Donald Trump to come in, and then we've got Jared Kushner pushing for Jerusalem to be made the new capital.
For reasons that are even more complicated than some of the other things that pop up in this conversation. That is pandering to evangelical Christians on the right of American politics, who think that when Judgment Day comes, Jews and Christians will be separated, and part of the preconditions for Judgment Day would be Jerusalem being the capital. I think I've understood this correctly. So they are no friends of the Jewish people. But I think since October the 7th, we've seen a hell of a lot of people who are no friends of the Jewish people promoting themselves as incredible champions of their cause. And that, well, you see that on both sides, don't you? But that would really give me pause, where I'm more invested in this personally. I'd often, and I know people don't like this, I often swap the word Jew for the word Muslim when I look at some of the rhetoric being deployed by people who claim to be champions of Israel and realise actually they're just bigots, hateful bigots who think that a vehicle towards indulging their own hateful bigotry, Israel can be that vehicle at the moment. And that's another reason why it's not difficult for me to muster up sympathy for everybody invested, personally, emotionally invested in this issue. The couple of Dina, someone's asking you for evidence, Zionist-owned media, evidence please, other than that people might be vaguely Jewish. I don't challenge that description because I don't think it does refer to the ethnicity or the religion of people that own the media. I think when people talk about Zionist-owned media, they mean media that is very, very supportive, historically and traditionally, of almost everything that Israel does in defence of its security and in defence of its safety. There are a million different definitions of that word, but if you're suggesting it's Jewish-owned media that is driving this, then you are indulging in an anti-Semitic trope, and I won't tolerate that for a nanosecond. 11:46 is the time. It is 11:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What a grim business this is. I think it's too serious a subject for Idiot's Corner, but and thank you to Laura for both picking up on this and responding so warmly and politely to the clarification. So people who can't answer the question really about how it can possibly be fair to withdraw all funding from UNRWA in the circumstances in which it has been withdrawn, just tying yourself in knots over the caller who used the phrase Zionist-owned media, which is an anti-Semitic trope. If by Zionist you mean Jewish, it's not difficult for me to say that, and yet you seem to think that there's some sort of zinger or point scored. It's a disgusting trope that very popular among supporters of the last Labour leader. I always remember a call I took when I was trying to explain why it's an anti-Semitic trope, and someone rang in and just said it's not anti-Semitic because it's true. And I thought, how do you even begin to unpick that position? Like, you can't possibly say that it's anti-Semitic to say that the Jews control the media, because they do, James. I tried my best, but as is often the case with people who ring in with the most pungent opinions, I'm not sure they went away having seen the light. And something else I have done, James, I'm so grateful for your programme. Just for info, if it hasn't already been noted, the Scottish Government hasn't paused or withdrawn its aid to UNRWA. It has already been noted. And also, as I noted at the time, increasingly I find myself having to clarify my use of the word Britain, because the policies being pursued by Rishi Sunak's government are increasingly at odds with the policies being pursued by Humza Yousaf's. Make of that what you will. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need if you want to have the last word on this conversation, because the clock is ticking. Sazana is in Croydon. Sazana, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi James, how are you?
I'm pretty good. What's on your mind?
A lot of people have covered a lot of things that I was going to say anyway, but I was just wanting to ask the question is, are we surprised? Are we surprised that they've pulled this out of the bag yet again?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? You're obviously not. I think for a few hours on Friday, I thought that might be game changing. Actually, the international court's ruling. The more I understood it, the more I thought, well, they can't gloss this one, but here we are watching them gloss it.
Well, no, because already a few days even before that, they had made it clear that they were going to.
I didn't mean they. By they, I didn't mean the Israeli government. I meant the British media, actually, but that's probably my obsession rather than yours.
Yeah, no, but saying about, you know what I think what's opened my eyes a lot since October the 7th is how much the government is controlled by a certain lobby.
What do you mean by that?
The funding. I wasn't aware of how much funding was given to each party, and how.
But what lobby are you talking about?
The Jewish lobby.
Well, that's where we wave goodbye to each other, I'm afraid. That's another anti-Semitic trope, which does you, or indeed the cause you profess to support, no favours whatsoever. Nigel Farage talks a lot about the Jewish lobby, Sazana. Do you agree with him about much else?
No, nothing at all with him.
Well, just have a little pause and think about what you're hopping into bed with when you use language and tropes like that. Bob's in Brighton. Bob, what would you like to say?
Hello again, James.
Hello,
I called in because you had a caller on a while ago who was asking about why the Palestinians have right to refugee status through generations. And I just wanted to, you did a brilliant job of dealing with him, but I just wanted to flag for your listeners, Palestinians have been living in refugee camps since 1953. And generations have been born, grown old, and died in those camps and continue to do so. So that's why they have those rights. Just to move on to what you're talking about.
The challenge to that would be that. So, what distinguishes them from other refugees elsewhere in the world? Do you see what I mean? Why do they have a different status from refugees elsewhere in the world? Our caller in Edinburgh, I think it was Ita, talking about his grandfather being a refugee from Iran or from Germany, and he's not a refugee by dint of his descendants from there. So what's the difference with Palestinian refugees and other dispossessed people across the planet?
That's a really complex question, James. You've surprised me there because I wasn't expecting that follow-up.
Well, it's kind of crucial. You know how this show works, Bob. That's kind of crucial to dismissing the point that he made. You have to explain to him why Palestinian people are different and that a sort of inherited refugee status applies to them in a way that it doesn't apply to other descendants of refugees all over the world. And if you can't, that's fine, but it's significant.
I'm happy to try. It's just there's a couple of other things I wanted to go on to before to your question, but I think it's to do with the complex history of the region and our involvement, Europe's involvement. This was a situation that didn't happen in a vacuum. We were involved in the management of Palestine prior to the Balfour Declaration. We were involved in the refugee crisis that arose from the Second World War. We were implicated in not taking Jewish refugees. We were implicated in the moral need to create a homeland for the Jewish people. And we are similarly implicated in this very live, very ongoing conflict, which continues to expand Israel's land and reduce the stability of the Palestinians and their ability to self-determine. And the gross I think that the reason it's such a live issue and it's been going on such a long period of time is why the Palestinians have these special rights. But I'm not an expert on that.
No, that's fine. And the issue of homeland is probably pertinent to it as well. The idea that you don't have a permanent sovereign homeland for dispossessed Palestinian people, whereas you kind of do for many other populations, but not necessarily all. So I take your point, and you're right, it's complicated. But I do want to give you time to squeeze in a couple of other points that you...
I'll be as quick as I can, James. And you're thinking about Rishi Sunak's response and
Yes.
the pulling of funding from this group. Now, what we're talking about is some members of this group, allegations against a small proportion of this group
Yes.
Being involved in heinous crimes. And that does need to be investigated properly.
Course.
However, on the other side, and Rishi Sunak has taken the decision as a country, we are going to step back from funding all the activities of that group.
Suspension, not cessation, but I don't think it makes much difference in the short term, does it?
The short term is the most crucial term, isn't it, right now, for what they do. But compare that to the ICJ's findings last Friday. We are still selling arms to Israel. That is a systematic involvement of an ally in reprehensible actions. And we are closely implicated. And if Rishi Sunak was being even-handed, he would say, yes, we're withdrawing funding because of these allegations against UNRWA, but we're also immediately going to stop selling arms to Israel because there's a risk of genocide and we do not want to be
the examples of irreconcilable differences in approach and attitude, I think, are legion now, and that is another one. So a United Nations agency getting punished collectively for the alleged actions of a tiny proportion of its workforce, while the findings of the International Court of Justice, which could not have been worse for Israel, they only really had the power. There's some debate over whether they had the power to call for a ceasefire, but they literally, in these early preliminary findings, could only have decided whether or not there was enough evidence to continue investigating genocide or to conclude that there was no point continuing to investigate it because of the evidence being so poor. And they've concluded that it is plausible. They've concluded that they absolutely are going to continue investigating the allegation, having seen so much evidence in support of it. So that it is extraordinary that has, if you like, moved off well, it's not extraordinary at all, but it is sad, I suppose. If you were to prioritise the things that matter most in the current context, you would think that the survival of the 2.2 million Palestinian people would be rather higher up the list of Western government priorities than it appears to be today. Thank you, Bob. Last word to Sarah in Birmingham. You've got about a minute, Sarah. My apologies. What would you like to say?
It was just a quick one to say that basically trying to justify, what the Jewish or the Israeli people might have been doing by, saying that these allegations of the UN workers, I've seen on social media that there's been interviewers they've interviewed protesters at the Karim Shalom border, the one in the north of Gaza, and they've been trying to say, we're protesting humanitarian aid coming in because, we want our hostages released, so they can't get any aid until our hostages are released, which again is like collective punishment. So,
well, it is. I've mentioned that a few times today. It is literally one of the things that the International Court of Justice.
It's a weapon of war.
Yes, stopping aid getting in. So you can't have this aid until those terrorists whom you have no influence whatsoever give up the hostages that many people believe the Israeli government have abandoned anyway. Thank you. You said you'd do it briefly, and you have. How many Tory MPs have been sanctioned for misconduct, James? Should we suspend their funding? Meaning the entire Conservative Party. These parallels aren't perfect. Do you defund the entire Metropolitan Police because of the number of rapists and racists they've been found to have in their ranks? They are not perfect analogies, but they are pertinent. The notion of responding to allegations against a tiny proportion of a workforce by withdrawing funding from the entire work of the entire workforce is a little odd from the outside, and we've spent 2 hours trying to make it a little less odd. And we failed. I don't think anybody has really managed to do that. But we have perhaps come to a better understanding of what the hope is. 3 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Now, I am fairly confident that the next conversation we are going to have does not leave either of us open to some of the unpleasantness that perhaps inevitably will always accompany conversations about the situation in the Middle East and the conflict in Gaza in particular, but it is a strange one. I'm not doing the private schools conversation today because a few of you pointed out that it's a phone-in host's dream, but it's not necessarily the most relevant issue facing the population at the moment. And we've done quite a lot already for everybody suggesting that I should be talking about the coming changes to border rules. We went in quite deep on that on Friday, and we will do again. But the sort of broader question of when people are going to actually start having rather more honest conversations about Brexit is constantly bubbling away in the back of my mind. I don't know, but I feel that it's coming. I feel the time is getting closer, and it's probably coming around a little bit quicker than I thought it would. Whether as a consequence or despite Keir Starmer's relative quiet on the issue, I don't know. It's too early to say, but you're getting quite a lot of stuff about the reality of what people voted for coming home to roost at the moment. So I want to talk about the government's announcement. And vaping is a weird one for me. I somehow have managed to, despite having 2 teenage children, I've somehow managed to almost completely bypass it. In the office, I'm always interested, I don't think I'll mention any names, but I'm always interested by who has like strong opinions on a subject, and it's often not the people that you expect to. And I'm always interested by who's got a sort of personal investment in the subject as well. I'm so out of the loop on this conversation for reasons that I can't fully understand. I have never had even the vaguest puff or toke or whatever the correct technical term may be. I don't think I've ever held a vape in my hand. And yet over the last few years, the scale of the story has become bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where today the government is to ban disposable vapes. And the reason why they are doing this, they say, is to address the massive take-up of vaping among the younger generation. We wondered at the time of Rishi Sunak's announcement of a ban on the sale of cigarettes to anyone born after the 1st of January 2009, whether it was undermined or likely to be undermined by the popularity and prevalence of vaping. And this would seem to suggest that they share that concern. It's going to come in early next year, by which time we might have a different government, of course. And so there are some people objecting to it. And this is a wonderful example of the reason why it's very important to know who pays the wages of Tufton Street think tanks, because up pops Tufton Street's favourite politician, Liz Truss, to describe Sunak's plan to ban cigarettes progressively as being profoundly unconservative. And I think that might be the way into this conversation for us today. There are 2 elements to it. There is the education regarding vaping. I was under the impression that it was more or less fine to vape for a while, and then I heard stories about children being hospitalised with all sorts of problems. And also like 11-year-olds being addicted. And they are designed to taste like sweets as well, of course, I'm told. That's the thing. That was my introduction, really, to them, was sort of walking down the street and saying, blimey, that smells like someone's boiling Haribo over there. So someone's making a Haribo syrup over there. What on earth is that smell? And it turned out to be vaping. My children, who I don't talk about much on the programme because it's bad enough having me for a dad without me putting their business all over the airwaves, but they did their own. They started telling me some time ago that vaping was not very good for you. And I can't remember why, but they even found some research somewhere that told them it was worse than smoking cigarettes, which I was fairly confident wasn't true. But I thought, well, if they're believing that and they're not smoking cigarettes, then I'll leave that one unchallenged, I think, and they'll end up doing neither. And touch wood, and I know that some dads may naively think that their children haven't discovered certain vices when in fact they have. Jason, a few people telling me that you need to be careful on this, but I don't get it. I don't get it. And I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. That's essentially the question. What do you think of this proposal? I really, really, really like it. I don't care about these libertarian arguments. I really don't. In fact, the older I get, the more ridiculous I find them. Oh, you've got to give people the freedom to hurt themselves. Why? Well, I mean, disposable vapes sound disgusting. They're appalling for the environment because you throw them away. You've got these lumps of moulded plastic all over the place. And somehow, and this perhaps is one element of the conversation we should discuss, I think young people have ended up in a place where they've got no idea how much damage they're doing to themselves. So let's begin with that. How much damage are they doing to themselves? 0345 6060 973. And how have we ended up in a place where people didn't realise how much damage they were doing? So I remember when the cigarettes were banned, it was a bit like when payday loans were banned. I just said, look, these people will find another way of getting their money. Government steps in and turns that tap off, and they'll pop up and turn another tap on. I think that there's been a huge explosion in online gambling since they shut down payday loan companies. And I, for one, would not be enormously shocked if some of the people behind the explosion in online gambling were the same people that were behind the explosion in payday loans. There is a sort of an attitude to business. You see the population almost as a crop that you can harvest every year, and once you close down one mode of harvest, they just come up with another one. Excuse me, I've got a tickly throat today. It's probably because I haven't stopped talking since 10 o'clock. And I thought the same about smoking. I thought, well, they're banning this. They're turning off a big old tap there with the smoking ban. And I don't mean the ban on sales, which is due to come in, well, which has come in for people of a certain age. I mean the ban on smoking in public places. It's going to take huge chunks out of the market. And I thought, well, they'll come up with another one. They'll come up with other ways of making their money. And I'm fairly confident that big tobacco is neck deep in the so-called vaping industry. So what's wrong with the government? This is a question I've got for you. And I know there are answers to this that are compelling and persuasive. And I should probably admit that you might persuade me. But the problem that the so-called libertarian position has, for me, in this country, is that all of the people pursuing it are horrible. I mean, they're either stupid or unpleasant or both. I use Liz Truss as a shining example. An extraordinarily inept politician possessed inexplicably of the view that she's a genius. So I think as a younger man, I would have leant towards the idea that government shouldn't interfere in my right to do unhealthy things. You know, I don't think the government should limit my freedom to do unhealthy things, because I really liked doing unhealthy things as a younger person. But the older I get, the more I think, what's the point of having governments if they're not trying to at least encourage us to look after ourselves? I always think of Jamie Oliver and those mums who were shoving turkey Twizzlers through the chain link fence at the school where he was trying to bring in healthy school meals. And I sort of thought, well, build a bigger fence. These people are foolish. Jamie Oliver is showing more concern for their children's health than they are. So it's where the phrase nanny state comes from, isn't it? The idea that the state does have a responsibility sometimes to protect the population from itself. And I think the reason I'm so rude about people who call themselves libertarians is that they seem to ignore the existence of anybody else. It's often highly educated and privileged people who insist that people who are not highly educated or privileged should be free to continue pouring money into the pockets of whoever it is that secretly funds their think tanks. I find it extraordinary, for example, when they talk about a sugar tax on fizzy drinks, that nobody points out when claiming freedom issues, nobody points out that your freedom is enormously compromised by the amount of money that's spent on encouraging you to pour fizzy drinks down your throat and your children's throat, in contrast to the amount of money that's spent on encouraging you not to. So what else do you need there, if not a tax? You have a ban on advertising, but vapes seem to sidestep that. I don't really see vapes being advertised on the telly. But you're probably not allowed to, are you? I don't know. You don't need to advertise them because every shop you walk past has got 400 in the window. So I completely understand why children have been drawn to them. I don't understand how we've ended up with this curious juxtaposition of popularity coupled with ignorance. I don't know how bad they are for you, but I do know this, and I think this carries a little bit more weight than usual because I'm normally quite critical of the current government. I don't know whether you've noticed that. I think this is a bloody brilliant idea. I think the idea of getting rid of something that is bad for the people that do it, bad for the environment in which it is done, and bad for just about every element of the population that comes into contact with it, is an unalloyed good. And I think it's quite brave, given that Rishi Sunak comes from the same party that Liz Truss comes from, and they are very much in the pockets of the secretly funded think tanks doing the bidding of their secret donors without ever telling you who it is that pays their wages. And they always come out against sugar taxes and smoking bans, and Liz Truss even talking about the ban on cigarette sales being profoundly unconservative. I think this is a really good idea, and you are welcome to try to stop me from thinking that. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Is this a very, very rare example of Rishi Sunak doing something both bold and important? Because some people won't like it. It will have an impact upon various levels of society. And a ban is, in some senses at least, likely to annoy people who consider themselves to be conservatives or at least libertarian. So I like this ban, and I want to know what you think of it. 0345 6060973. And I mentioned a moment ago, being a younger man, I'm pretty sure that as a younger man, the word ban was provocative to me. I think I didn't like bans. I don't know what's changed. This is me getting a bit more small c conservative as I get older, but then it up-pobs Liz Truss to say that this isn't a conservative policy at all. It's almost like nobody knows what that word means anymore. So it's not just a question of whether you support the ban on disposable vapes or whether you oppose the ban on disposable vapes. It's also a question of freedom. It's a question of whether or not this is the sort of thing that governments should be doing. Because I find that one a little bit harder to answer. I'm very surprised to find myself at the age of 52 on the side of the government banning things that are unhealthy. But I am on their side. Perhaps you need to remind me why I shouldn't be. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. The time is 12:16. It is 90 minutes after 12. There's I often say there's two topics here. There's like the micro and the macro, isn't there? There's the conversation about what we think about a politician banning vapes, disposable vapes. It's a bit like trying to put the genie back in the bottle, I would argue, but good luck. I like it. And then there's a question about governments banning things that are bad for us, just because they're bad for us, and whether or not that is totalitarian or undesirable. I don't know why my voice went up several octaves as I said both of those words. Totalitarian. I shouldn't like it, but I do. How many more topics can I get away with turning into free therapy sessions for me, do you think? I shouldn't like this, but I do. I don't vape, but I don't like the idea of a ban on governments, brought in by governments on vaping. I don't like that because I'm rebellious and anti-authority. But I do like it. I really like it. I love the idea. They should do more. They should ban, palm oil and trans fats and all sorts of other things as well. Ban it. I'm becoming a fan. I'm becoming, in middle age, a ban fan. And I don't understand why. Perhaps you can tell me. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. I don't know how to pronounce this name. Is it Flav, as in Flavor Flav, or is it Flav?
It's actually Slav.
Slav with an S?
Yes.
Well, someone's put Flav with an F on my screen, which made me think of Flavor Flav. But I'm glad
it would be a good name.
It would be a good name. Unfortunately, Slav, someone's beaten you to it. Now, what made you pick up the phone? What would you like to say?
So, what I would like to say is that although I do feel, and certainly when I was younger, I was more of a libertarian myself. But as I grow older and I become more conscious of why the healthcare system actually exists for,
yes,
I think it is fair for the government to introduce measures up to banning certain things, because it then has a duty to take care of your health through the public healthcare system in whatever state it is. But that's a different discussion, right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Because government is an agency of the taxpayer, which is the society, and we as a society take care of our own, then I think it's fair that we should be able to, in a way, prevent them from hurting themselves in the first place, so we don't need to spend as much funds on them treating them. Because there is no law which says that a vapor is not eligible for healthcare because they were hurting themselves.
I know, and I mean, I certainly wouldn't want a law like that, although you do have, I think, cases of operations being postponed for people who haven't given up smoking or haven't lost weight. So it's not a zero-sum game, is it, on taking personal responsibility for your health before you can access certain health care, before you can access certain health interventions. But how confident are you that vaping is really unhealthy? Because it's obviously much healthier than smoking cigarettes.
That is true, and I would not argue with that. I mean, like, if you can call it like a lesser of two evils, if you like.
Yes, exactly that.
But ultimately, I think there is this like more moral argument, if you like, that do we as a society take care of our own? Because to me, it sounds a little bit like inhumane to deny people health care because they did something wrong.
Yes.
I mean, like, we all do mistakes. We're all human for making mistakes.
Yes.
I think that's what part of what makes us human. But then if we do, like, say, forgive, we certainly don't want to encourage, because then it creates this sort of like a moral problem that people will perhaps be more lenient and as to how they take care of their health, because
they know there's a massive big safety net catching them at the end of it. Well, I mean, subconsciously, Slav, I think they might feel that way. It'd be quite hard to prove, wouldn't it, behaviourally, that because of the strength of the NHS, people are more likely to behave in an unhealthy manner. It's not an argument I've heard before, and I like it, but I don't know that you'd be able to prove it. One thing I can prove, thank you, Slav. One thing I can prove is that they've nicked this wholesale off the Labour Party. October 2023, Wes Streeting threatens to come down like a ton of bricks on the vaping industry. The Shadow Health Secretary said the government is asleep at the wheel as more children become addicted. So a timely reminder there of two things. Number one of the reasons why the Labour Party has been a little bit, has not taken much notice of all of the people demanding that they release more policies, because if they release a policy that proves popular, Rishi Sunak will nick it, as he has done apparently with the vaping policy today. But number two, a reminder also of the dangers of footballification. If you liked this when Wes Streeting announced it, you're not allowed to dislike it when Rishi Sunak announces it. You're allowed, if you're a Labour loyalist, to be a little bit peeved at theft, blatant policy theft, but it doesn't change your qualitative judgment of said policy, does it? And no one's yet had a go at trying to explain why in middle age I'm becoming a band fan, much to my own surprise. Hamza's in Barnet. Hamza, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I hope everything's okay with yourself.
So do I now. You've got me worried. Go on.
No, so talking about this issue, there's a few things which will obviously come to mind straight away. First and foremost, I want to make it clear that I am on your side with regards to the libertarianism that's going on right now. Yeah. I think governments are entirely in the right when doing things for their own society will benefit its people.
Yes.
I don't see any issues with that. The obvious issues that come to mind when you put bans on these vaping products and addictive products is first and foremost the black market which arises, which is something that obviously will be looked into and that needs to be looked into. With regards to that black market, the one thing that I would say that I am concerned with is if it's the younger generation that are really into these vaping addictions and whatnot. As you said, there's 11-year-olds who are addicted, for example. Does it give them an incentive to access the black market at such a young age because of the addiction that they've gained?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? Because you would arguably, if you haven't already developed an addiction, then this will make it harder for the next generation or the upcoming generations to develop an addiction. But But then the ones that are already addicted are going to go down the market and start buying all sorts of dodgy stuff that's actually already illegal because of the strength of and the scale of the doses. But well, you tell me then, because that's not. I mean, that throws some nuance into the discussion, but it doesn't end it one way or the other, does it?
No, 100%. And my main worry with it, regarding this black market, is if we're introducing a black market first and foremost. Let's say there's a 12-year-old that's addicted to vaping now. If they find access to this black market somehow, some way, which is very possible in today's society with all these mobile phones and social media and whatnot. I'm speaking like I'm an oldie. I'm really not, honestly. But if these 12-year-olds do gain access to the black market at such a young age, if we're teaching them what a black market is at such a young age?
But you can anything, and you could say this about anything, couldn't you? You would know. I know that the availability of the illegal vape is obviously much higher. Yeah. And they are more dangerous than the legal variety. But you could by saying, if you make something illegal, you push people underground. You can apply that to absolutely anything, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
So I don't know, but I like your thinking. I like your argument, but I don't know that the creation of demand for black market disposable vapes is a. And I know you're not arguing that it is. You're just bringing it into the mix. Is a conclusive argument against a ban on legal disposable vapes. I mean, the plausibility question. God, that's the word of the day, isn't it? How plausible a policy this is. How feasible a policy this is. I don't know, because if you're not allowed to sell them in shops, there is going to be a huge decline in the number of people buying them. Full stop. I mean, there's no earthly way that the black market can expand to a scale that would fill the hole left by the legal market. I don't think there is. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I doubt it. On that element of the conversation, Helen is in Moira in Northern Ireland. Helen, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think it just needs to be a bit more logical legislation, because blanket banning something that actually supports people to quit. I get, like, youth vaping is an issue, right? Like 100%, just like back in the day, youth smoking was quite an issue.
Yes.
And that with more legislation, you can stop that. But the cause is just the youth smoking. If that's what they're trying to cut out, then it impacts on people who are trying to quit. And this is another really good way of adults quitting smoking. And the incidence in the UK is coming down because the UK is quite open to vaping. There's lots of other countries around the world that aren't, and their smoking rates are in some cases increasing.
Oh, that's interesting. How? Because we're going to run out of time. How important is then the distinction when you talk about proportionality between disposable and non-disposable? Getting rid of disposable vapes doesn't stop anybody vaping, whether they're a child or not, but it makes it much less likely on the child's case because of the cost involved.
Potentially, but it also, if there was more legislation around the retailers being responsible, because it's illegal to sell it to an under 18.
Yeah, but good luck with that. They can't even arrest shoplifters anymore. They're not going to go start arresting shopkeepers, are they?
But if they linked it to alcohol, you need a license to sell alcohol in the UK.
Yeah.
If it was linked to that, and then if you get age verified, so trading standards go in and you sell alcohol to an under 18-year-old, you lose your license. So you lose a revenue stream, so it encourages retailers to be more responsible. Because in theory, kids shouldn't be vaping. They shouldn't be able to get hold of it, but somebody's selling it to them. So if you clamp down on those people, it allows any adult consumer to choose what they're consuming. So it's not necessarily like killing the libertarians, but it means then that people can still access this stuff if they want to.
I like it. Well, yeah, I mean, we will have to wait and see the detail of the policy, whoever brings it in, because it's more likely to be a Labour government that's actually in place if and when it actually happens. But the other side of the argument, you like the sort of principle as opposed to the practice of it, is at least as interesting. And I don't know. I mean, if you're addicted to nicotine, aren't you, if you vape? And then if the disposable vapes are banned, what does the nicotine addict do? Nick their dad's cigarettes, probably. I don't know. I'm not sure Rishi Sunak knows. Nobody knows. But I'm still asking the questions. It's 12:30. And Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It is 12:34, and it's all about the vapes. It's all about the vapes. Gary's in Ilford. Gary, what can you tell me?
Hi, James. I have a son. He's 15 now, but 6 months ago, he started vaping.
Right.
He had a girlfriend who encouraged him to do so. That's the story.
Jezebel.
Yes, and we only found out a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
But he's petrified because he very quickly moved from nicotine vapes to seeking out THC vapes, which are cannabis.
And they're illegal, presumably.
Well, as I understand, I don't know.
Well, it must be. If it's got the psychoactive ingredient in it, then it must be illegal.
Oh, I think the psychoactive one is, but there's another one which doesn't have the psychoactive version.
Well,
He was
then-
experimenting.
All right, well, that's not got
and-
THC in it then, because THC is the psychoactive ingredient. And I think the reason why they're available is because of the states in America that have legalized cannabis, where you can get it in everything these days, from biscuits through to chewing gum and vape. So anyway, it won't be illegal unless it's got the THC in it, but carry on.
Okay, but he's experimenting
Yes.
at the point, and he's experimenting with things that are, tuberculosis, people turning up at school.
Yeah.
And he found that he got a vape that he's very concerned has spice in it, because the illegal vapes apparently are covered with spice. And his friends, and himself have worked themselves up into a frenzy of fear, because they think they've done brain damage, permanent damage to their brains with, they're all petrified. Now, the problem is...
Well, you live and learn. You'd know if you'd taken spice. I mean, I spoke to someone who was in prison for dealing... but I've spoke to someone who's been in prison for dealing drugs and smoked spice once and spent 12 hours flat on their back on a prison cell floor and couldn't... I mean, you would know if you had taken spice. You wouldn't be left there wondering whether you have or not. It would hit you around the head like a shovel.
I don't know.
I do. I'm just to put his mind at rest. If he'd taken spice, he'd flipping well know about it.
Okay, but he's moved from nicotine to
cannabis,
another substance,
and then to illegal stuff when you don't know what you're inhaling. So you've got to get him off the nicotine. And would a ban on disposable vapes help or not help?
Well, in the immediate context, I'd say absolutely yes. But what we've done, we're buying our 15-year-old son nicotine vapes at a lower concentration than he was taking, because I think it was 20 milligrams or something like that. So we've got the weakest possible concentration, and we're going to ease him off, but that's the plan, over the next couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. I used to smoke, and it takes a little period to kind of come off the...
Well, you've got till January.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can nail it. I'm struck by them all being terrified. Are you sure he's not swinging the lead a bit to keep his dad sweet? What did he do? Come and say to your dad, I'm really worried because I've become addicted to these vapes you didn't know I was using.
I haven't had the conversation. My wife's having the conversation.
Oh, okay. Because I can't quite. It's a while since I was 15, but I don't know that I'd be, I'm really frightened I might have taken something accidentally and damaged my brain.
He has other conditions, which means he delves very deeply into anything.
But you mentioned all his mates are the same as well. All his mates are terrified as well. I think you need to put their mind at rest that they probably haven't done anything. If they had done themselves any lasting damage, Gary, I'm pretty sure they would know about it. I mean, again, I can't in the same hour go from admitting my own profound ignorance about the issue to counselling you and your son on how worried you should and shouldn't be. But I mean, I'm interested in that addiction that he has to a nicotine vape. And knowing a little about addiction, the moment that supply of disposable vapes is cut off, the first reaction of an addict would be to find another way of feeding your habit, wouldn't it? And that would involve either paying a lot more money for non-disposable vapes, which would probably bring down your usage solely on cost grounds, or, and this would be the worry raised earlier, or going underground, going onto an illegal market for considerably less healthy and less regulated product, which it sounds like he's already done. Joe's in Islington. Joe, what do you reckon?
Hi. So you've actually just touched upon something very important.
Really? There's a first time for everything, Joe.
Which is that there are two types of vapes. There are disposable vapes and there are reusable vapes. And as far as I'm aware, the proposed legislation just targets disposable vapes. So
yes.
In many ways, this is more an environmental policy than it is an actual public health policy. Because we're talking about, for example, children here who have access to vapes. They may not be able to buy their, £5 vape from the local corner shop and throw it in the bin after school, but they will still be able to access and use vapes, but they will just have to buy a vaping product that is refillable and then buy the cartridges that refill it. So it's not quite as clear-cut as it's going to be completely banned and completely inaccessible.
So, well, the disposable ones will be.
Yeah, just the disposable ones.
And that will only really affect... Well, okay, so if you were 15, would that make you... That means you're going to struggle, you're going to have to work a bit harder to get a hit, right?
Potentially, I mean, so disposable vapes are about £5 in your local corner shop.
£3, I heard. £3 sometimes, or £9 for 3. One of my colleagues told me this morning.
I mean, I think the bigger thing here, which the government could be doing, is actually dealing with the way when you go into these corner shops. Whereas cigarettes, for example, as we know, they're hidden. You can't visibly see them.
Yes, the vapes they look like Haribo, don't they? They
exactly.
look like a big ray of sweets.
Exactly. They're right at the front of the counter, next to sweets. They're almost always on offer.
And the flavours. I'm sounding so old, Joe, but here we go. In for a penny, in for a pound. The flavours are like... It's like something out of Willy Wonka.
I know, but the advantage is when you come home from a nightclub, you now smell of pineapple and bubblegum rather than cigarettes. So that's an upside.
No, that is a massive upside. So you're allowed to smoke them indoors then? You're allowed to vape indoors, or do people just do it anyway?
You're not supposed to. People tend to do it. They tend to get away with it more. But I think it's a very important point, though, you've mentioned here, which is that it's the packaging and the flavours, right? Because I don't know if you remember, in 2020, the government banned methanol cigarettes. So minty cigarettes. Menthol, cigarettes.
Yeah.
You know, which had they had a little bit of mint in them. And
yes, I remember those. I used to think they were terribly sophisticated.
So the logic is that, by having a minty burst of flavour, you're encouraging smoking. But at the same time, with vapes,
you can have a lemon sherbet vape, but you can't have a minty cigarette. It is a very, very strange one. And if they wiped out all of the sweety flavours, I'd say they'd probably wipe out 80% of the appeal.
Exactly.
In fact, you should only be able to have vapes that taste like cigarettes, and then the kids would give them up in a heartbeat.
Cigarettes in cardboard flavour.
Cigarettes in cardboard flavour. I like it. Thank you, Joe. It's a funny one. I mean, the more we talk about it, the more you wonder how big an impact this is likely to have, simply because of the shift to permanent. What's the word of non-disposable vapes? But then you're back to the shop question. So most listen, don't at me with accusations of naivety. Most shopkeepers have a frisson of fear, as indeed do most publicans, about being caught selling booze to underage customers. It is actually enforced. This is one of the things I know from having teenage children, is that ID is a big deal. And if ID is a big deal, it means they're getting asked for it a lot more than we were when we were 16 or 17. So if you could somehow translate that concern among shopkeepers and publicans about alcohol into similar concern about vapes, then you'd probably deal with the problem a lot more effectively. But there's almost certainly a flaw in that thinking, otherwise a politician would have pointed it out already. Richard's in Clacton. Richard, what do you think?
I think it is an absolutely fantastic idea.
Why?
Pretty much like your last caller said, it's not all vaping that's being...
So why do you hate disposable vapes, but you're comfortable with non-disposable ones? What's the difference in your mind?
Why were the disposable ones were invented basically for children?
Were they?
Because they can use them when they're out. When they're finished, they just throw them away. Whereas if they've got one that they've got to use the whole time, then there's more chance of their parents finding them.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, okay. I wonder what the breakdown is, actually, generationally or demographically, between the usage. If you found here is a disposable vape, what percentage of users is likely to be a child as opposed to an adult? I don't know that I've seen any research on that.
I myself and my brother, good friend, have been using vapes for years.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't even consider a disposable one. Why would you? The reusable ones, you can get one for 30 quid, which then costs a couple of pounds a month to maintain.
Right.
With your juice and your...
So it is about targeting. The disposable ones are designed almost exclusively for children. And my colleague, who shall remain nameless, who has a minor disposable vape habit, despite being in his mid-20s or her mid-20s. I don't want to give you any clues at all as to who I am talking about. It's coming up to 1:45. No one yet has had a go at why I, at the age of 52, have become a band fan. I'm pretty sure if you were kind enough to listen to this program 100 years ago when I started, we must do some centenary celebrations, Keith. We should get a theme tune or something like that up and running. I'm pretty sure I was anti-ban. I was not a band fan. I'd be like, no, I must be free to do myself harm. And I've been one of the many journeys I've been on as a consequence of having this job, realising that the worst thing you can do is think that the entire world should be legislated for according to your own outlooks, privileges and experience. Because if you do that, then you ignore everybody else. But I am a little bit surprised at this tender age to find myself developing quite a fat band fan streak. Why do you think that is? 03456060973. And what are the long-term effects of disposable vapes? Are they worse than the long-term effects of non-disposable vapes? I do not know. But I do know they nicked this policy off Wes Streeting. And if I was him, I'd be a little bit hacked off. 12:48 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I did quite like this story from Will. He goes, I've got a friend who's so addicted to vaping that he's started smoking to wean himself off the vapes. His logic is that he intrinsically knows cigarettes are bad and will eventually need to kick those. And because he knows sort of intrinsically in his bones that they're bad for him, he'll find it easier to give those up than he would giving up the vapes without using the cigarettes as a sort of bridging tactic, a crutch to get you to the point where you need to give up both. I've no idea if that will work. And John, well, we're finding a lighter side of this conversation. John says, flavoured vapes are the closest some kids will come to getting their 5 a day. You've given me an idea there, actually, is that you could have carrot flavour vape. You could only have vapes that are flavoured like vegetables. That would probably stop the problem of children vaping, wouldn't it? Carrot and pea. Oh, and I must thank the team at Saint-Agur, who heard me the other day raving about the delicious consequences of adding some of the Saint-Agur cream cheese to Brussels sprouts, and they sent me some cheese and some sprouts. That's rock and roll, that is, kids. That's showbiz. That's how it works, this business. Seriously, you work hard at school. You might get sent sprouts and cheese one day by one of the country's leading dairy companies. Sprouts and cheese and sprouts. Make me a vape that tastes of sprouts, and I'll be a 40 a day man, or whatever the equivalent. I digress slightly. Christo's in Prague. Christo, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Finally, I get to chat to you, mate. I love your show.
Oh,
Thank
they
you
were
very
so
much.
kind. Thank you very much.
Yeah. You made me make some good decisions in my life, so I do appreciate it.
Oh, lovely thing to say. Thank you.
I don't think the government's gone far enough, pal.
Go
to be
on.
honest, I think they should just ban vapes in shops permanently.
Wow.
And the reason being, I actually switched from cigarettes. I was smoking probably 15, 20 a day.
Yeah.
I switched to vapes. Within 3 months, everything was going fine. I felt lovely. I was like, oh, you're topping up quite a lot. And I was on permanent vapes. I wasn't on the one-offs. And I was smoking them like mad. One night, woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly got an asthma attack. I've never had asthma in my life.
Oh, Lord.
I used to have a lot of sport.
Right.
I've represented countries.
How many?
Sport.
How many countries have you represented?
South Africa. I represented South Africa.
Okay.
In sports, yeah, for roller hockey, ice hockey, and taekwondo.
Flipping it, mate. Wow.
I then left. I then
go on
left South
Superstars.
Africa. Yeah, I then left South Africa. I then started actually playing for a club in the UK. I was offered to play in the UK, and unfortunately, the word "we shall not speak" came up. And I went, I'm not happy here anymore, unfortunately. I don't feel well. My wife does,
No, I thought I didn't know what. I thought we were going a bit weird then, Christo, but no, crikey. No, I can't. Well, I can. I'd be out of a job if I didn't. My entire profile is built on it.
It's like Voldemort and Harry Potter. You can't say that.
He who shall not be named. Do you know for sure that the asthma was brought on by your excessive vaping?
100%. And the reason being, I had it. Luckily, my wife has got asthma herself.
Right.
She went, he's having an asthma attack. She gave me the pump.
Yeah.
I hit it. I hit it 3 times. She saved me. You know, luckily she loves me.
Evident, clearly.
I did it.
But I don't know. Listen, you're doing the thing I just said we shouldn't do, is that you're taking your personal experiences, pumps and all, and thinking that they should be used to frame legislation for the entire population. A lot of people successfully wean themselves off cigarettes by vaping, and then I think they knock the vaping on the head subsequently, don't they? So I don't know that your call for an outright ban is
correct. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But when I spoke to more people, and I fully agree with you, when I spoke to more people that were actually open about vaping,
yes,
a lot of my friends that switched to vaping turned around and went, I've got breathing problems.
They haven't given up at all.
I am battling. A lot of them were actually vaping more than what they smoked.
Yeah, well, that is really interesting, actually. So it's sort of causing problems, even as we're constantly told that it solves them. Christo, I'm going to crack on because there's loads of people wanting to contribute, but thank you for your lovely, kind words, and I look forward to talking to you again. So they're nibbling at the edge, really, of the problems with this. But if you're specifically addressing children, then getting rid of the disposable vapes, I haven't yet heard any powerful arguments why it's not at least worth doing. Retailers get 6 months to implement it. How big a chunk is it going to take out of a newspapers and news agents' profits, a ban on disposable vapes? I mean, some of the shops near me have a lot of them. I wouldn't know the difference between a disposable and a non-disposable, but everything behind the counter. Oh no, because then you get the ones that you use to fill up a permanent vape. They look a little bit more business-like. Am I right? Or I don't know what I'm talking about. Liam's in Bristol. Liam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How you doing?
Good, mate. What's on your mind?
Okay, so I just really think this is just a blunt instrument. I just think it's a knee-jerk reaction by our government. They don't understand the problem. And the problem they're going to face is counterfeiting. And counterfeiting in the context of, I'll give you a good example.
Yeah.
My son, who was 13, he started selling counterfeit vapes.
Did he?
Yes, he did.
Gosh.
He got them from somebody who was somebody older. It was kind of a gateway route into becoming, a dealer.
What's the appeal of a counterfeit vape? It's cheaper than a non-counterfeit one, and it contains more doses. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I think there's three. This is where it's not been implemented properly. Is that you don't have to buy from the shop, so there's no one asking how old you are.
Yeah.
It's probably stronger and it's cheaper.
Yeah.
And we found out about this. He was making very good money.
How much?
He was clearing about £200 a week selling them.
It's not bad. And that was happening even while his friends could buy disposable vapes legally. So why would it make things worse necessarily to ban the legal ones? Because you could make this argument about everything. You could say, counterfeit, I don't know, trainers or counterfeit handbags, counterfeit puffer jackets. If the more you ban the... No, that doesn't work. No one's going to ban trainers, are they? You try and imagine what argument I was about to make, Liam.
I know what you're saying.
Try and imagine the argument I was about to make and respond to it, please.
Okay. So my point is that
so
if you ban vapes from
then you're going to go. Retail, then you're going to go for the dodgy stuff. You're going to go underground.
People are going to go underground,
and that'll be less regulated, less safe, and less.
So what I'm saying is, still do the ban, but don't do it as a knee-jerk reaction for popular votes. Do it as a proper programme of getting to the counterfeiters, having a proper process, proper legal route to get rid of that. And I think the other part of that is education, because there's nothing. I mean, I'm a child of the 80s, so I remember the anti-HIV, the anti-HIV, which scared the living daylights out of me and changed my behaviour pretty quickly.
What on earth were you doing in the 1980s that exposed you to the risk of HIV?
I was a good-looking lad, but anyway.
All right. We've covered quite a lot of ground here with you and Christo, but I do take your point, and that's why perhaps the fact that the Tories appear to have just pinched it from the Labour Party doesn't fill you with confidence, but it doesn't necessarily make it a bad idea. And you use the word knee-jerk a lot. You would hope that the clampdown on, because it's already illegal to sell any vape to anyone under 18. So if they'd come in harder on that, it might have made more sense. But it is the disposable vapes sold in smaller, more colourful packaging than the refillable ones that are apparently the key driver behind the alarming rise in youth vaping. I accept and also dismiss your argument, Liam, because I think you're right. I think there would obviously be an uptick in, if you like, illegal or counterfeit vapes, but it wouldn't it would still have a very, very big, a much, much bigger impact on the amount of kids using the non-counterfeit or the sort of official ones. Tom's in Maidenhead. Last word to you on this, Tom. What's it going to be?
I think getting rid of them is a good idea. I personally started them because they taste good. They taste like fruit. They taste like one of your
They don't taste like fruit.
They taste as sweet as you want them to taste.
Yeah, they taste like sweets. They don't taste like fruit.
You could get the fruit-flavoured ones.
Yeah, but you get fruit-flavoured sweets. They don't taste like fruit either. They taste like sweets.
The point I'm making is they don't taste like anything harmful. Smoking has a horrible aftertaste.
That's a great point.
That you can taste, and some people smell it on you, and it puts people off. Whereas the vapes, they taste and look like a toy, and it's very, very easy to.
But can you not buy sweet-flavoured refills for the normal vapes, for the permanent vapes?
You can. The issue with that is that the packaging is a lot more, from what I've experienced, is a lot
child-friendly.
No, hazardous. From the refillables, they'll give you your fair warning like they do on cigarettes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that would be another thing as well to address the packaging. So no really powerful arguments against it, and no one's really had a crack at trying to work out psychologically why I've become a band fan in my early 50s. It's a bizarre state of affairs. That is it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. This week's Full Disclosure is on there as well. You can download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com, and it's an absolute humdinger. I got so many nice comments about it over the weekend with James Blunt, who is just an absolute superstar in every sense of the word, actually. So do check that out if you get the chance. Tom Sawbrick with you at 4. But now on LBC, it's time for Sheila Fogarty. You see, 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 it's time for Sheila Fogarty.